Imagine everything you have ever been told about the death of Jesus being built on sand, and imagine that for centuries, people have bowed before an image that never truly existed the way they were told. Because the crucifixion, the very event said to be the cornerstone of Christian faith, carries within it gaping holes, contradictions, and a trail of silence so deafening that it should make every thoughtful person pause. And this is where we begin, with the shocking claim that the crucifixion was not merely misunderstood or misinterpreted, but engineered, shaped, and implanted into the minds of believers through a careful process of editing, omission, and invention. And the first proof lies in the very sources that Christians cling to most desperately, the Gospels themselves. Because if you place Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John side by side, the supposed eyewitness reports that should harmonize into a clear historical event, you instead find storylines so contradictory that no modern historian would accept them as reliable. One gospel places Jesus silent before Pilate, while another paints him as defiant. One has Simon of Cyrene forced to carry the cross, while another insists Jesus carried it himself, and one depicts the sky darkening for hours as cosmic chaos unfolds while others are silent about this supposed miracle. Now ask yourself, if the earth shook, if graves opened, if darkness fell across the entire land, why do historians outside of Christian writings not record these apocalyptic events? Because Roman chroniclers obsessed with omens and wonders remain completely silent. Jewish historians like Josephus, despite their meticulous recording of cosmic signs, say nothing of this day when supposedly heaven itself rebelled, and this silence forms the second proof, because the absence of external confirmation from Roman or Jewish records screams fabrication. It is inconceivable that a Roman execution in a politically tense environment, one allegedly surrounded by earthquakes, solar eclipses, and resurrected corpses, would not merit even a single reliable mention outside of church-constructed texts. What is more, Pontius Pilate himself, the Roman governor who supposedly condemned Jesus, has records detailing minor executions, administrative decisions, and even inscriptions bearing his name, yet there is not one authentic Roman record confirming the crucifixion of Jesus. Instead, what we find is later Christian writings retroactively trying to insert Pilate into the narrative, forging letters and reports to create a veneer of authenticity. And so we stand with two crushing proofs at the very foundation: the contradictions in the very texts that should be united, and the absolute silence of history beyond those texts. And if that does not shake you, then you must ask yourself why every detail of this supposed defining event reads less like history and more like a constructed drama, a passion play designed to stir emotion, but not to convey truth. Now pause and reflect. If the most important moment in human history is riddled with irreconcilable contradictions and uncorroborated by every external source of its time, what does that say about the foundation upon which billions rest their faith? Does it not echo like a hollow drum, powerful in sound yet empty within? And as you sit with that thought, know that we are only beginning, because the proofs only grow heavier, and the silence of history is only the first of many. Cracks that show the crucifixion as a fabricated event, carefully staged by those who needed a dying savior to build their theology upon. Words so shocking that they beg the question, if the crucifixion never happened, what else has been a lie all along? What else have we been taught to believe without evidence? And how much longer can the silence be ignored? Remain with me, because the story is about to descend even deeper into the labyrinth of deception, and each step will make it harder for you to ever look at the crucifixion story the same way again. For once the truth is unveiled, it can never be unseen, and what was once sacred will reveal itself as invention, manipulation, and myth carried forth under the name of truth. If the first two proofs shook the ground beneath the crucifixion story, the next layers of evidence will expose why the event was fabricated, because when we strip away the veil of blind faith, we discover that the crucifixion narrative served political and theological agendas far more than it served history. And here lies the third proof, the role of Rome itself, because crucifixion was not simply an execution method, but a highly public and deeply political display designed to send a chilling message to all who opposed imperial rule. Romans did not crucify in silence. They made spectacles of it, lining the roads with crosses, boasting about their dominance, and meticulously recording events that could intimidate subjects. Yet in the case of Jesus, the so-called King of the Jews condemned for treason, we find no Roman archives, no imperial decrees, no proclamations, nothing. And this absence is not trivial. It is fatal to the claim, because a man condemned as a political threat and crucified at Passover in front of crowds should have ignited records. Yet only Christian texts decades later tell this story, revealing that the tale was crafted not by the state, but by the church. And the fourth proof ties directly into this, because if crucifixion was truly the means of execution, the burial narrative makes no sense. Romans never granted crucified criminals honorable burials. Bodies were left to rot as warnings, thrown into mass graves, or eaten by scavengers. Yet the Gospels insist Jesus was given a pristine tomb, provided by a wealthy disciple, watched over by mourners, treated with spices and cloth, a story that aligns far more with Jewish honor and theological drama than Roman practice. Historians point out this burial account violates every known Roman policy, meaning it is a literary device to exalt Jesus in death rather than a reflection of fact. Now pause with me, because when you realize that the very punishment Rome perfected as public shame was rewritten by Christian storytellers into a sacred burial, you see fabrication, you see transformation of a brutal reality into symbolic theater. And that makes you ask, who benefited from rewriting the humiliation of crucifixion into a glorious burial? The answer is clear. The early church, because they needed their Savior not to rot on a cross, but to emerge as a king who even in death was honored, respected, and vindicated. And this is why the contradictions and silences scream louder with every step, because what should have been a public political execution became a private theological drama, rewritten to inspire devotion rather than document history. So reflect on this. If the crucifixion as described would have been a public spectacle, why is it absent from Roman memory? And if burial by a rich disciple was impossible under Roman custom, why do we find it in the story? The answer is because someone wanted you to believe in something that never happened. Someone needed the death of Jesus to carry not the stench of defeat, but the aroma of divine victory. And so we see how fabrication crept in, weaving itself into the story until truth was buried beneath layers of invention. And if 2,000 years of tradition have blinded us to this, then today you see it more clearly. The cracks in the crucifixion narrative are not minor inconsistencies, but colossal fractures that reveal the entire foundation as built upon myth. And the deeper we go, the more the evidence aligns, not with the cross on a hill, but with pens in the hands of authors decades later, shaping theology through fiction rather than eyewitness testimony. And with that, we stand at four undeniable proofs: the contradictions of the Gospels, the silence of history, the absence of Roman records, and the burial story that defies all known customs. And if that is not enough to make you tremble, then remember, we are not even halfway through, and what comes next will dismantle the very core of the crucifixion belief, until nothing but invention remains. So brace yourself, because the lies are only beginning to unravel, and once you see the web, you will never again believe it was spun by truth. And now we plunge deeper, because the next proofs not only reveal cracks in the crucifixion story, but show outright fabrication that cannot be dismissed as mere oversight or misunderstanding. And here we encounter the fifth proof, which comes from the very writings of Paul, the earliest Christian documents we possess. Because if anyone should have given us a vivid account of the crucifixion, it is Paul, the missionary who claimed to spread the gospel only a couple of decades after the supposed event. Yet read his letters carefully and you will see the silence. He speaks of a Christ crucified as a theological idea, but offers no details, no place, no time, no Pilate, no Calvary, no thieves at his side, no women at the cross, nothing resembling the passion drama later painted by the Gospels. And this silence screams because Paul was writing to communities who needed convincing. And if the story of the crucifixion as we know it existed, he would have used its power to persuade. But instead his Jesus dies in cosmic abstraction, a mystical sacrifice without nails or wooden beams. And this tells us the story had not yet been invented in its dramatic form. And so the crucifixion as we know it was not history remembered, but fiction later created. And the sixth proof stands with archaeology and Jewish practice, because crucifixion victims were rarely, if ever, buried in tombs. They were discarded, and archaeology confirms this with the discovery of skeletal remains from crucifixions where bones were left pierced, damaged and disposed of without honor, never carefully wrapped and sealed in wealthy tombs. Jewish law itself considered crucified victims cursed, defiled, and unworthy of ceremonial burial. Yet the Gospels present a sanitized story where the Jewish elite supposedly fought for the body of Jesus to receive respectful rites, a contradiction so glaring that historians know this was theological invention, not cultural reality, because Jewish authorities were not lobbying Rome for the dignity of a condemned blasphemer. They were distancing themselves from him. Yet the story rewrites reality so believers would see Jesus as chosen even in death, and the more we examine the evidence, the clearer it becomes that the crucifixion tale was sculpted not from memory, but from need, from the desire of early church leaders to give meaning to the death of their figurehead, to align it with prophecies, to construct a passion play that would stir hearts. For centuries now reflect on this. If Paul himself never described the crucifixion in detail, if archaeology denies the burial story, if Jewish law would never have allowed the treatment described, then how can we continue to claim this event as historical? How can we say with confidence that it happened as written, when every shred of evidence points to the opposite, that the drama of the cross was a fabrication inserted into texts to turn a movement into a religion, a teacher into a savior, a death into a myth? And you must ask yourself, how many centuries of worship have been built upon this silence, this contradiction, this fabrication? And if faith is meant to be truth, what happens when the very foundation collapses under scrutiny? Because every word you have heard so far dismantles the story, leaving nothing but invention. And we are not finished, because the next proofs will reveal how the crucifixion was not only fabricated, but borrowed, copied, and reshaped from older myths. And once you see the parallels, you will realize that the cross was never history, but theater dressed as destiny, and that realization will change forever how you look at the symbol that has dominated 2 millennia of belief. As we continue tearing through the illusions that have kept billions convinced for centuries, we reach the 7th proof, and it is perhaps the most devastating because it shows that the crucifixion story was not even original, but borrowed from older pagan myths of dying and rising gods. Long before Jesus, the world already had Attis, Dionysus, Osiris, and Mithras, figures who were said to have suffered, died, and returned, their deaths serving as cosmic sacrifices for their followers. Their stories filled with symbolism of blood, renewal, and victory over death. And when we place these myths beside the crucifixion narrative, the parallels scream fabrication, because the supposed uniqueness of Jesus collapses into recycled mythology. The Romans and Greeks who shaped the world of the early church were already immersed in tales of divine beings whose deaths brought salvation, and the early Christians, eager to compete in this spiritual marketplace, wove their own version, creating a crucifixion scene that mirrored pagan archetypes, but branded it as history. And this brings us to the 8th proof, the deliberate theological motive of early church leaders, because without a dramatic death, the figure of Jesus would have remained another forgotten preacher in Judea, his teachings perhaps admirable, but his legacy weak. Yet with the crucifixion story, with the image of a God suffering and bleeding for humanity, they created an emotional core that could bind communities, inspire devotion, and demand loyalty. Fabrication became necessity because without it the movement would collapse. And so gospel authors carefully shaped every detail, aligning the story with Hebrew prophecies while borrowing themes from pagan myths, blending them into a narrative that sounded divine yet felt relatable. The suffering savior motif gave them a powerful weapon, one that transcended cultures and broke down barriers. But when we recognize it as borrowed, we see that it was never history. It was myth repackaged, designed to compete and to conquer, and this realization should shake the very cross itself in your mind, because the death of Jesus as told was not recorded fact, but borrowed fiction, a mosaic of older myths and theological need. And when we strip that away, the figure that remains is unrecognizable, not a God crucified for humanity, but a man whose story was rewritten until he fit the mold of every dying God myth before him. And now pause with me and reflect. If the crucifixion story was borrowed and shaped to fulfill needs, does it not reveal that the event was never meant to be history, but theater, staged on the page for audiences desperate for meaning? And if the core of faith rests on myth disguised as fact, then what does that say about everything else built upon it? And if this realization makes you uneasy, it should, because truth is never comfortable. Truth disrupts. Truth demands we see through the lies, and that is exactly what we are uncovering. Here, not a minor discrepancy, not a small misunderstanding, but the wholesale fabrication of an event that billions hold sacred. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it, because every time you look at the cross from this moment on, you will see not history but invention, not sacrifice but strategy, not divine truth but human fabrication. And though it may feel like the ground is vanishing beneath you, remember that reality stands stronger without the illusions, and the 9th and 10th proofs will leave no doubt that the crucifixion was fabricated and that the Church has known it all along. And here we arrive at the final descent into the truth that the Church never wanted you to see, because the 9th proof reveals the hand of deliberate editing by councils and church authorities who, centuries after the supposed event, gathered to decide which stories would survive and which would be silenced. And it was in these councils, such as Nicaea and others, that the crucifixion narrative was solidified into dogma, polished, canonized, and declared untouchable. But history shows us that alternative texts existed, gospels and writings that told different stories, some that denied the crucifixion outright, others that depicted Jesus escaping, still others that spiritualized the event as symbolic rather than real. Yet these voices were crushed, banned and destroyed so that only one narrative would remain, the fabricated crucifixion story, chosen not because it was true, but because it was useful for control, useful for unifying doctrine, useful for building power. And this leads us to the 10th proof, the ultimate blow, which is that the crucifixion became central not because it happened, but because without it, Christianity could not exist. The theology of salvation demanded blood, demanded sacrifice, demanded a cosmic drama of suffering, and so the event was constructed, exaggerated, edited, and enforced until it became unquestionable, and yet beneath it all lies silence, contradiction, and myth. And now pause with me for the crushing reflection. If the crucifixion was fabricated, then the foundation of Christianity as you know it collapses, because without the cross, there is no redemption story. Without the cross, there is no resurrection. Without the cross, there is no theology of sacrifice. And if all of that falls away, then what remains is the truth that the figure of Jesus was transformed by human hands into something he never was. And that transformation was not the work of God, but of councils, scribes, and leaders who understood that a dying Savior could command devotion in ways a living teacher never could. And so the cross became their tool, their invention, their masterpiece of fabrication. But now exposed, it becomes their undoing. Because once you know the truth, you cannot unknow it. Once you see the fabrication, you cannot pretend it is fact. And as this revelation settles within you, you must ask yourself, what will you do with this knowledge? Will you cling to the illusion or embrace the truth? Will you choose comfort or reality? Will you continue to bow to a story written by men, or will you stand free in the light of what truly happened? And if this truth has already shaken you, imagine what more we will uncover together. Because the crucifixion is not the only fabrication, and the lies do not end here. They spread through every corner of the texts waiting to be revealed. And if you want to continue breaking free from the illusions, then stay with me, because what is coming next will shake even deeper. So subscribe. Now, because if this truth already rocked your faith, imagine what the next revelation will do. Subscribe so you do not miss the full truth, because the crucifixion was fabricated, and that is only the beginning.